Hello friends, so today's video we're going to be going over the Goodreads Choice Award nominees winners, specifically for the fantasy category. Is anyone surprised that House of Sky and Breath won? No. Are we tired? Yes. I think we're all just like, yeah, we know. Can something change so it's not just the book with the most ratings always winning? I mean, we all know it's a popularity contest, but still, anyway, I'm already getting sidetracked. So I wanted to go through and list off in order the ones based off of votes. So House of Sky and Breath won, it had the most votes, and I want to go through and go in order from House of Sky and Breath down. But then there's a couple of things that I found really interesting that I wanted to point out that I don't know if other people have noticed or been talking about, but it kind of relates to one of the things that I had previously stated as what I thought could be an improvement or an interesting thing for the nominees to, I guess, for the Goodreads nominations to take note of. But now looking at a certain detail, my thought was I basically just have to go back on it. Anyway, let's jump into it. So reading off, in the number one spot, we had House of Sky and Breath. At the second place, we had Babel. Then from there, we had Fairy Tale. Then fourth would be The Atlas Six. Fifth, The War of Two Queens. Sixth, Daughter of the Moon Goddess. Seventh, Irregular Witches, or that's how I abbreviate it, but the Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches. And then after that, we have Legends and Lattes, The Lost Metal, Golden Enclaves, Electra, KKE, The Book Eaters, When Women Were Dragons, Nettle and Bone, The World We Make, A River Enchanted, Thistlefoot, Stardust Thief, and Ordinary Monsters. On Goodreads, they will list how many votes each of the books had, so that way you can see the difference from, first to second, second to third. And actually, Babel and Fairy Tale were extremely close. So Babel had 62,732 votes, and Fairy Tale had 60,818. So that was pretty surprising. The Atlas Six, I mentioned in my video where I was talking about the Goodreads nominees that I don't know how I feel about books that were previously self-published in a different year. I misspoke. I had thought that Legends and Lattes came out a previous year, but it came out this year. But the Atlas Six did not. It came out a different year. So it already built up a pretty big fan base. And then you have it listed this year, which was weird to me because the sequel could have been listed this year. It came out within the time frame. So I was like, why didn't they just have that one? People have pointed out that the nominees seem to be based off of how many people add something to their want to read shelf or something like that. You can tell I don't really use Goodreads. Anyway, it has to do with people shelving things and their interest. And then I think you have to have a certain average rating. It has to be above a certain amount. It can't be really, really low. So I think that's worth noting because I think a lot of people were like, how could they have left out this, and this? And there's a whole list of books that they're confused by. But it's not like there's a group of people all huddled together, like figuring out which ones they're going to include. And I'm going to make a statement by not including this other one or something. That seems to be the case. I don't know. It's not very transparent. They don't make it very clear how this becomes what it becomes and which ones are nominees. So I say that because I know I mentioned, even though I haven't read the conclusion, but I was surprised that it wasn't there, was Jade Legacy. And that one, I was talking about how people loved it. It had an extremely high rating. It did come out within the time frame, so it's weird that this one isn't there. And then one of you pointed out, well, it's based off of how things are shelved. And I believe you, but I'm also like, I feel like that's more popular and that more people would have shelved it than some of the other ones on this list based off of just how few. So apologies. Hopefully my camera doesn't shake too much. I'm grabbing my notes here. But Ordinary Monsters, for example, had 2,156 votes, and the total amount of ratings was 6,201 at the time, because I wrote down the amount of ratings, which we'll get into something interesting with that. So looking up Jade Legacy, because I was like, I feel like it's pretty popular, right? So when I look up Jade Legacy, which is, if you don't know, the third book in the Greenbone saga, it has 11,757 ratings. So it has not quite twice as many, but it has a lot more. And people who read the second one and have read and wanted to read the third one, like, I would think they're going to shelve it, but maybe they didn't. I don't know. I don't know how this list comes to be. What I will say is they need to fix the system. There's no chance ever. If a book has a lot of ratings already, it's gonna win because the fan base is just bigger. And I know some people are like, who cares? It's just a popularity contest. It doesn't mean anything. And to some degree, I'm like, I mean, nothing, no list means anything. There's a little part of me that's like, I mean, whatever about most of them. But at the same time, I also don't want to be like that. I don't want to be cynical. I don't want to be bitter because it's really meaningful to the authors. It means a lot when they see their books nominated. And that's not just for Goodreads. It's for any best of list. I don't know too many people, like when R.F. Kuang had the Poppy War on that Times list, and I think she had more than one book in the Poppy War series, I don't expect R.F. Kuang to be like, ugh, this list is meaningless. You're going to be excited that you were included and that people value your work. Anyway, I'm starting to go off on a side tangent here, but the thing that I wanted to point out, so one way that I thought the Goodreads nominations and the awards could be more interesting was to take a look at what percentage of people who have read the book voted for it, because that speaks volumes. To let you know, House of Sky and Breath had 105,718 votes for it in the nominations. It has a total of 166,526 ratings. That's how many people have read and rated it, or you would hope that they've read it if they rated it. That's how many people have rated it. And then you get that 105,000 amount of people voting for it. So that's a 61%. 61% of the people that rated it, if we're looking at the exact same amount, meaning there are going to be people that vote that didn't rate it. But for the sake of this, point, we'll say that they were all people who rated it. Anyway, so that's 61%. That's pretty good. But let's take a look at Babbel. Babbel had 62,732 votes, which is a lot. It doesn't stand a chance when, House of Sky and Breath has 100,000 more ratings than that. But anyway, it had over 60,000 votes. It only has 28,638 ratings. Who are all these people? My point before was thinking, okay, to take that percentage, 61% of people, supposedly, who have rated it are voting for it. But when you have something like Babbel, let's say Babbel didn't have this lopsided view. Let's say 80% of the people who had rated it ended up voting for it as their number one pick. That would tell me, okay, even though a smaller amount of people have read it, the people that have read it loved it. They loved it a lot, enough to vote for it over all these other things. But that concept, I did not realize would completely fly out the window, because we have like 35,000 additional people who didn't rate it that voted for it. Because, again, the numbers, over 62,000 votes for Babbel, and then 28,000 ratings. So a few things could be happening here. It's possible that people who read in general, I was going to say who read Babbel, but this is applicable to any of these. It's possible there's a lot of people who don't rate books on Goodreads, but they like participating in the nominations. Okay, that's possible. It's also possible there's a lot of people that are like, I'm tired of seeing Sarah J. Maas win. I'm going to vote for whatever I think the next thing is that stands a chance. And then they probably looked at the list and they're like, oh, shoot, I don't want to vote for Stephen King either. I'm going to vote for R.F. Kuang. That's a possibility. There's plenty of people that vote that haven't read the books that they're voting for. So there's no way to really, as far as I know, there's no way to prevent it unless you have to have it on your Goodreads shelf before you're allowed to. But the easy workaround is you just say you read it, I guess, right? I mean, how determined are people to be dishonest? I don't know. But anyway, I don't know if that would be a huge barrier if you really want to vote for something. But I thought it was interesting to compare how often that happens. So with Babbel, like I said, you're looking at almost 35,000 more people voting than rating. With Fairy Tale, it was almost the exact same number. So you had 60,818 votes, and the amount of ratings was 60,296. So it was basically 100%. The Atlas 6, you had 57,401 votes, and then 92,272 total ratings. So that one was closer to House of Sky and Breath as far as the numbers go. What I find interesting about this is I think House of Sky and Breath and the Atlas 6 are ones that people would point to and go, ugh, the fan base. The fan base doesn't even care. They're going to vote for her no matter what. When in actuality, it's possible that the fan base for Stephen King and R.F. Kuang are more guilty of that. You know what I mean? But anyway, I just found that really interesting, and even more interesting, in my opinion. Daughter of the Moon Goddess. I'm mentioning this one, and there was a couple others, Thistlefoot and KKE. These 3 fantasy books were also under debut, because that's a separate category if you didn't know. So with Daughter of the Moon Goddess, within the fantasy category, it had 33,066 votes, 32,039 total ratings. So just above 100%, right? Another kind of weird turnout there. But for debut, this one, I thought maybe I would see more people voting for it within debut than within fantasy, because I said about this book that I think it's going to be appealing to people who don't typically read fantasy. So I'm guessing that people who were looking at the other debut books were like, I liked Daughter of the Moon Goddess, but maybe they don't. Basically what I'm saying is KKE, if I were to vote, I would probably not vote for KKE as my number 1 within the fantasy section. I would maybe vote for it as number 1 within the debut, if that makes sense. So I get there being an imbalance, like in one area you're going to have a lot more votes than you did for the other category. But again, a little over 100% for the fantasy. But then with Daughter of the Moon Goddess for debut, it had 58,601 votes. And again, if you need a refresher, 32,039 total ratings. So I'm like, who are all these people that come out of the woodworks to vote for the debut category? That's interesting. The same thing happened for KKE. This one had about half the amount of people who have read it voted for it within the fantasy category. So you had 6,145 votes and then 13,141 ratings. For debut category, you had 16,741 votes and then roughly 13,000 ratings. So same thing happened. You had more than, first off, you had more than even the amount of ratings, but then you had a lot more than the amount of votes within the fantasy category. Thistlefoot I haven't read, but it's interesting still. You had 3,369 votes, 3,984 ratings. Okay, so a large percentage of people that read it voted for it. Hopefully there were people who read it. And then under debut, the same phenomenon happened where it was 4,568 votes and then 3,984 total ratings. So I find that very interesting. Does this, what do you think this, I was going to say, what do you think this means, as if it's some like conspiracy or something? But my conclusion is that people who are reading fantasy books perhaps are more likely to be engaged in a sense of community online. I think that's true, right? You see fandoms for a lot of fantasy stories, and then as a result of being online, as a result of watching BookTube or Book Talk or being on Reddit or things like that, it then leads you to inevitably go to this other corner of the internet called GOODREADS, and you keep track of what you're reading. And I think a lot of fantasy readers are quite voracious readers, and so we're reading a lot, and this helps us keep track. Whereas something like the debut category, I'm wondering if those are people who, and I don't say this in like I'm putting them down like they're not real readers or something, but they might be people who don't read as often, who maybe, they'll go into a bookstore and they'll look at the tables at the front, they'll pick up a popular book, or they'll see something talked about here and there when they go online. They're like, oh, maybe I'll pick that one up. It gets recommended to them from a friend, something like that, where they're maybe reading more broadly. And as a result of reading more broadly, they are maybe a little more familiar with the books that are in the debut category, but they're not familiar with the books in the fantasy category as much. So that could be, and then on top of that, it would make sense as to why every single time the debut votes were always so much higher than the amount of ratings, because maybe those people don't really go rate books frequently. Maybe they just want to participate in the choice awards, It's like people who, maybe this isn't true at all, but maybe it's like people who really aren't movie people, but then suddenly they care a lot about the Oscars, right? Where you're like, you don't follow this regularly, but you're excited to get to see like what's gonna win, and you have your really strong opinions even though you've probably not even seen half the movies or whatever, right? So I think there is something fun about participating in these awards, but it might also be true that people don't participate actively on Goodreads typically, because I really was surprised at how many more votes I would see than ratings. And that's just me, I think, being a little bit more benefit of the doubt, having that mindset, because what I said earlier is also very true, that people could just be like, I don't want this other thing to win, and so they voted for something else that they hoped would have a chance. Anyway, what was surprising to you about the Goodreads nominees winners? I don't know, why do I say it like that? The Goodreads winners. The Goodreads winners. What was surprising to you? What was not surprising at all? Like the fact that Sarah J. Maas won again. And I have done a number of videos at this point about things that I think could be improvements. I talked a little bit about it this year. I did a whole video dedicated to it last year. I've talked about it over on my collaborative channel called World Hoppers, where we've had discussions about Goodreads, and a lot of my friends talk about it too. I think a lot of us are probably like-minded. So if you have an opinion that you feel like doesn't get voiced very often, or a point that you would like to make, I'm interested in everybody's thoughts, but I'm especially interested in something that maybe isn't the same old of like, they need to fix it. What I said at the beginning, basically. So, anywho, I hope this was interesting. I hope it made sense what I was saying about votes versus ratings. Hopefully that wasn't too confusing. I know for some people they hear numbers and they're like, I'm not listening anymore. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you all have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.